grand hall was already alive long before the guests began to arrive. It was one of those rare places where everything looked perfect from the outside. Tall golden lights hung from the ceiling, shining down on polished marble floors that reflected every step like a mirror. Soft music played in the background as workers made final adjustments to chairs, curtains, and the stage where the night's main performances would take place. Everything had been prepared for weeks, because this was not an ordinary evening. It was a royal cultural gathering, known for bringing together some of the most respected musicians, critics, and powerful guests from different parts of the world. Outside the hall, luxury cars began to arrive one after another. Doors opened slowly, and elegantly dressed guests stepped out with calm expressions, as if they already belonged to the place. Some smiled for cameras, others walked straight inside without even looking around. Everyone here had a reputation. Everyone here was someone important in their field. The atmosphere carried a silent pressure, as if every person was being judged even before the event began. Inside the hall, conversations were polite but careful. People spoke in low voices, avoiding anything that might sound careless or uneducated. This was the kind of place where even silence felt meaningful. In one corner, a group of musicians discussed past performances, while across the hall, critics exchanged opinions about who might impress the audience that night. Among them, one name kept coming up again and again. A royal music critic known for his strict standards and sharp tongue. He had the power to make or break careers with a single review. Many respected him, but just as many feared him. He arrived without much attention at first, walking in with a calm and confident posture. His expression showed little emotion, as if nothing around him could surprise him anymore. He had seen thousands of performances in his life. He believed very few artists were truly special. Most, in his opinion, were simply trying too hard. That belief had made him famous, but it had also made him cold in the eyes of many younger musicians. As he took his seat in the front row, a few people nearby greeted him politely. He responded with short nods, not wasting time on unnecessary conversation. His attention quickly shifted to the stage. For him, the event was not about celebration. It was about evaluation. At the same time, far from the main entrance, a young pianist quietly stepped into the building through a side door. She was not dressed in expensive clothing like most of the guests. Her outfit was simple, neat, and modest. She held a small bag close to her side, as if it contained something very precious. Her eyes carefully observed everything around her. The grandness of the hall did not intimidate her, but it clearly made her more alert. She was not widely known in elite circles. Her journey had been very different from most of the performers here. She had learned music in small rooms, sometimes practicing on old or slightly damaged instruments. She had played in local gatherings, small cultural programs, and quiet community events. Yet there was something about her performances that people remembered. Something emotional, something deeply human. That was how she had received this unexpected invitation. A short video of her playing had reached someone connected to the event organizers. They had seen something in her style that could not be ignored. It was not perfect technique that impressed them. It was feeling. Raw and honest feeling that seemed rare in trained performers. Still, when she arrived at the venue, she could immediately sense the difference between her world and this one. People walked past her without recognition. Conversations continued without pause. She was just another face in a crowd of important names. But she did not complain. She adjusted her grip on the small bag and quietly followed the signs toward the preparation area. In the hallway leading backstage, she paused for a moment. The sound of a piano being tested echoed faintly through the walls. She closed her eyes briefly, listening. Music had always been her way of understanding the world. When words failed, sound spoke. When emotions became too heavy, notes carried them away. A staff member guided her toward a waiting room. It was simple but clean, with a few chairs and soft lighting. Inside, a few other performers were already there, mostly older and more experienced musicians. They glanced at her briefly but returned to their own thoughts. No one asked her name. No one started a conversation. It was clear that everyone was focused on their own upcoming performance. She sat down quietly near the corner of the room. From her bag, she carefully took out a few sheets of music. They were slightly worn at the edges, showing they had been used many times before. She did not look nervous, but there was a quiet seriousness in her expression. She knew the stage would be different from anything she had faced before. Outside the room, the atmosphere in the hall grew even more intense as more guests arrived. Conversations became louder, laughter more controlled, and expectations higher. The royal critic remained seated in the front row, occasionally glancing at the program schedule. He had already formed opinions about most of the listed performers. In his mind, very few would stand out. As he reviewed the list again, his eyes briefly stopped on a name he did not recognize. It belonged to the young pianist. There was no long description, no history of major awards, nothing that suggested importance. He frowned slightly, almost annoyed that someone like this had been included in such a high-level event. In his experience, unknown performers rarely surprised anyone. He leaned back in his chair, already assuming what kind of performance it would be. Probably average. Maybe even forgettable. He had seen it many times before. Young musicians invited for fresh talent sections, only to struggle under pressure. He did not expect anything different tonight. But what he did not know was that the young pianist sitting quietly backstage was not thinking about impressing anyone. She was not thinking about critics, reputations, or rankings. She was thinking about sound, emotion, and the story she wanted to tell through her music. Backstage, a soft announcement began to prepare performers for the first segment of the evening. The young pianist stood up slowly. She placed her music sheets back into her bag, took a deep breath, and adjusted her posture. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were deep. She knew that once she stepped onto the stage, everything would change, even if only for a few minutes. As she walked toward the performance entrance, the sound of applause from the opening act filled the hall. The audience was already engaged, already judging, already forming expectations. She stopped just before the stage curtain, listening to the final notes of the previous performance fade into silence. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The noise of the world seemed far away. Only the sound of her breathing remained. She did not know how she would be received. She did not know what people would think of her. But she knew one thing clearly. Once she sat at the piano, she would speak in the only language she truly understood. And that night, in a hall filled with judgment, pride, and expectation, a quiet young pianist prepared to step into a world that had no idea what was about to unfold. The grand hall was already full of life when the second part of the evening began. The first performance had ended with polite applause, the kind that sounded respectful but not deeply emotional. People clapped because it was expected, not because they were truly moved. Still, the event continued with its usual elegance. Waiters moved quietly between rows offering drinks, and soft conversations filled the gaps between performances. In the front row, the royal critic sat in the same position, his posture unchanged. He had not been impressed by the opening act, but that was normal for him. His standards were high, and he rarely changed his opinion easily. He looked around the hall with calm eyes, observing the audience more than the stage. To him, people were often more interesting than performances. Their reactions revealed more truth than the music itself. Backstage, things were beginning to shift. Performers who had already finished were returning quietly, some relieved, others disappointed. A few whispered to each other, trying to guess how they had been received. But in one corner of the waiting area, the young pianist remained silent. She had not yet performed. She was sitting alone, hands resting gently on her lap, eyes focused on nothing in particular. She was not nervous in the usual way. It was something deeper than nervousness. It was awareness. She could feel the weight of the hall even from behind the curtains. The energy of so many important people, all gathered in one place, created a kind of pressure that was hard to ignore. Still, she did not let it disturb her thoughts. A staff member passed by and reminded her softly that her turn was getting closer. She nodded politely. Her expression did not change much, but inside she was already preparing herself. She had learned long ago that music was not about impressing others. It was about expressing something honest, something that words could not carry. Meanwhile, in the hall, the royal critic was engaged in a quiet conversation with a few other respected guests. They were discussing talent selection and the future of classical performances. The critic spoke with confidence, as always. He believed modern performances were becoming too emotional and less technical. In his view, discipline mattered more than feeling. One of the guests mentioned the upcoming performers, including the young pianist who had been invited unexpectedly. The critic's expression changed slightly when he heard her name again. He had already seen it on the program list, and it had not left a strong impression on him. He responded with a calm but dismissive tone, saying that many young performers were given chances they were not ready for. According to him, talent needed years of refinement, not sudden recognition from small viral moments or local attention. A few people around him nodded politely, not necessarily agreeing, but not willing to challenge him either. At that moment, the young pianist was still backstage, unaware of the exact words being spoken about her. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple outfit and slowly stood up. The waiting area had grown quieter now. The earlier performers had left, and only a few remained. A staff member appeared at the door and signaled her turn was coming next. She followed without hesitation. Her steps were steady, not rushed, not slow. As she moved through the narrow corridor leading to the stage entrance, she could hear the sound of the audience settling again. Chairs shifting, light murmurs fading, attention returning to the stage. Just before she reached the curtain, she paused for a moment. The sound of the hall felt distant but heavy. She closed her eyes briefly. In her mind, she did not see the audience or the critics. She saw only the piano keys. She saw sound as shapes, emotions as movement. Then she opened her eyes and stepped forward. The announcement of her name was made clearly across the hall. It was simple, without long introductions or dramatic praise. Just her name and the mention of her being a young pianist. A few polite claps followed, but they were light, uncertain. Some people barely noticed. Others glanced briefly at the stage, expecting another average performance. The royal critic leaned slightly forward, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. He had already prepared himself for something ordinary. The young pianist walked onto the stage. The lights were warm but intense. For a moment, she stopped at the center and looked at the audience. The hall was large, filled with people dressed in elegance and authority. But she did not let the size of the crowd overwhelm her. Instead, she bowed slightly, respectfully, and moved toward the piano. Her footsteps were soft on the stage floor. Every movement felt controlled, as if she had practiced not just music, but presence itself. When she reached the piano, she sat down carefully, adjusted her position, and placed her hands above the keys. A brief silence filled the hall. It was the kind of silence that comes before judgment, before expectation turns into reality. In the front row, the royal critic folded his hands. He was watching closely now, not because he believed she would impress him, but because he was ready to confirm what he already assumed. The young pianist took a slow breath. For a brief moment, she did not move. Then her fingers touched the keys. The first note was soft, almost fragile. It did not try to demand attention. Instead, it invited silence. The sound spread gently across the hall, like a quiet wave touching still water. Some audience members adjusted in their seats. A few looked up more carefully. The second and third notes followed, forming a slow, emotional pattern. It was not fast, not dramatic, but deeply expressive. The melody carried something that was difficult to explain. It felt familiar, yet unknown at the same time. The royal critic narrowed his eyes slightly. He did not react outwardly, but something about the tone made him pay closer attention. It was not technical brilliance that caught him. It was something else. Something in the emotional phrasing. Backstage staff paused their movement, listening quietly from behind curtains. Even they could feel that the atmosphere in the hall was changing. The young pianist continued to play. Her hands moved with calm precision. Every note felt intentional. The music was not just being played. It felt like it was being told. A story without words. a memory without explanation. Some in the audience began to feel a shift. Conversations had stopped completely now. Even those who were not music experts could sense that something different was happening. The hall, which had felt formal and distant earlier, now felt more personal, more intimate. The royal critic leaned forward a little more. His expression remained controlled, but his focus had sharpened. He had seen many performances in his life, but there was something unusual about this one. Something that did not fit into his usual categories of judgment. Still, he did not yet understand what it was. The young pianist kept playing, and as the melody slowly deepened, it began to carry a feeling that no one in the hall could yet explain, but everyone could somehow feel. The hall had already fallen into a deeper kind of silence than before. It was no longer the polite silence of waiting or expectation. It was something more focused, as if every person inside had slowly forgotten why they were there and started listening without even realizing it. The young pianist continued playing, her fingers moving gently across the keys, shaping each note with careful emotion. The melody she created was not loud or fast. It did not try to impress with speed or complexity. Instead, it carried a quiet strength, like a memory being carefully opened after many years. Each note seemed to connect to the next in a way that felt natural, almost like a conversation without words. People in the hall began to notice that they were no longer thinking about the event, the stage, or even the crowd around them. Their attention had been pulled entirely into the sound. In the front row, the royal critic remained still. At first, his expression showed mild curiosity. He had expected something simple, maybe even weak. But what he was hearing now was different from his expectation. He had heard thousands of performances in his life, from beginners to masters, but this style felt unusual. It was not about technical perfection alone. It had something else hidden inside it. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the stage. He did not speak, but his mind was already analyzing every detail. The rhythm, the pauses, the way certain notes were held longer than expected. There was a strange emotional depth in it that he could not immediately explain. Backstage, a few staff members who were not directly involved in the performance had stopped what they were doing. Even they could hear the change in the atmosphere. One of them whispered quietly to another that the hall felt different now. It was as if the music had created a soft barrier between the audience and the outside world. The young pianist, however, was completely absorbed in her playing. She did not look at the audience. She did not look at the critics. Her eyes remained focused on the keys, but her mind was somewhere deeper. She was not just playing notes. She was expressing something she had carried for a long time, something personal and unspoken. As the melody continued, a subtle shift began to appear in the music. It was not obvious at first, but those who were truly listening could feel it. The emotional tone was becoming more layered. It carried a sense of longing, something almost nostalgic, as if the music was connected to a memory that did not belong only to the performer. The royal critic noticed it too. His expression changed slightly, though he tried to hide it. There was something in the phrasing of the melody that felt familiar. Not in a direct way, but in a distant emotional sense. It reminded him of something he had not thought about for many years. A style of playing that was deeply expressive, almost storytelling in nature, rather than purely technical. He frowned slightly, trying to place it. In his career, he had studied many great musicians. He had heard classical masters, modern performers, and experimental styles. But this feeling was different. It was not just about skill. It felt personal, almost intimate. On stage, the young pianist shifted slightly in her seat. Her hands moved with more confidence now, as if she had passed an invisible barrier inside herself. The music became richer, more emotional. It began to rise and fall like breathing. The hall, which had been completely silent, now seemed to hold its breath with every phrase. Some audience members closed their eyes without realizing it. Others leaned forward, trying to understand what they were feeling. A few had subtle changes in their expressions, as if memories were being stirred inside them. The music was not loud enough to overwhelm them, but it was strong enough to touch something deeper. The royal critic's thoughts became more focused. He could no longer simply judge the performance in a technical way. Something in the music was pulling his attention away from simple evaluation. He found himself listening more than analyzing. That alone was unusual for him. The melody continued to grow. There was a moment where the music softened again, becoming almost fragile. It felt like a pause between emotions, like a breath taken before something important is revealed. The young pianist's hands slowed slightly, holding a few notes longer than expected. The sound lingered in the air, fading gently into silence before the next phrase began. And then it happened. A shift in the melody. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But for the royal critic, it felt like a sudden pull in his memory. The structure of the notes changed slightly. The way the chords were arranged, the emotional flow of the phrase, the gentle rise and fall of the melody. It all carried a style he had not heard in years. His eyes narrowed. Something inside him stirred. Something he had buried long ago. The music was beginning to remind him of someone. He did not want to accept it at first. His mind tried to reject the idea. It was impossible, or at least highly unlikely. But the more he listened, the stronger the feeling became. There was a particular way the notes were being shaped. A softness in the transitions. A careful emotional control that felt deeply personal. His hands tightened slightly in his lap. Backstage, the staff remained unaware of the interchange happening in the front row. They only knew that the hall was completely silent now, more silent than at any point during the evening. The young pianist continued playing, unaware of the emotional shift she was creating in the audience. She was fully immersed in the music. For her, this was not about recognition or approval. It was about expression, about letting something flow that could not be spoken in words. The melody now carried a deeper emotional weight. It was no longer just a performance. Felt like a message. The royal critic's breathing slowed slightly. He found himself focusing more and more on the details. There was a specific pattern in the way certain phrases were repeated. A kind of emotional signature. Something he had only heard from one person in his life before. His thoughts became unclear for a moment, as memories tried to surface. He remembered a time long ago when he was much younger. A different hall, a different atmosphere, and a performance that had stayed in his memory longer than he had ever admitted to anyone. It was a style of playing that belonged to someone very important in his past, someone whose music had carried deep emotion and unmatched sensitivity. He shook his thoughts slightly, trying to stay in control. But the connection was becoming harder to ignore. On stage, the young pianist reached a softer section of the piece. The notes became more delicate, almost like whispers. The hall was so quiet now that even the smallest sound felt meaningful. The audience was fully engaged, not through excitement, but through emotion. The royal critic could no longer sit comfortably. Something about the performance was affecting him in a way he did not expect. It was not just recognition of talent. It was something more personal. Something that felt tied to memory, emotion, and time. He watched the pianist more closely now. For the first time, his judgment was not immediate. He was listening, not deciding. And as the music continued, a deeper question slowly formed in his mind, one he was not ready to answer yet. Where had he heard this feeling before? The hall had completely changed its atmosphere now. What started as a formal evening filled with polite attention had slowly turned into something deeper, something that no one could fully explain. The young pianist continued to play, and every passing second seemed to pull the audience further away from the outside world. The music was no longer just sound. It felt like emotion shaped into rhythm. Each note carried a quiet weight, and each pause between notes felt meaningful. People were no longer sitting as guests of an event. They were sitting as listeners to something personal, something that touched parts of memory they had not visited in a long time. In the front row, the royal critic remained unusually still. His earlier confidence had started to fade, though he would not admit it even to himself. He had built his entire career on judgment, on quick analysis, on clear standards of performance. But this performance did not fit easily into any of those categories. He leaned slightly forward again, his eyes fixed on the pianist. The way she played was not flashy or dramatic. There was no unnecessary movement, no exaggerated expression. Everything was controlled, yet deeply emotional. That combination was rare. And the more he listened, the more uncomfortable he became, not because the performance was poor, but because it was affecting him in a way he did not expect. Backstage, there was a noticeable shift in energy. Even the staff members who had been casually moving around earlier were now standing still, listening from behind the curtains. Some had stopped speaking entirely. The hall had become so quiet that even small sounds felt noticeable, like the soft shifting of clothes or the quiet breath of someone leaning forward. The young pianist, however, was unaware of the growing tension in the hall. She was fully inside the music now. Her fingers moved across the keys with calm confidence. She was not thinking about the audience anymore. She was not thinking about the critics or the importance of the event. She was simply letting the music flow through her. As the melody continued, something subtle began to change. There was a shift in tone, almost unnoticeable at first. The music became slightly more emotional, slightly more personal. It was as if the piece was slowly opening a door to something deeper. The harmony carried a softness that felt familiar, though most people in the audience could not understand why. The royal critic noticed it again. This time, the feeling was stronger. He felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not physical pain, but emotional discomfort. The music was doing something unusual. It was not just being heard. It was being felt in a personal way. His mind began searching through old memories without permission. He tried to focus on the structure of the performance, but something kept pulling him away from technical analysis. There was a style in the playing that reminded him of someone he had once known very well. Someone whose music had always carried emotion that could not be ignored. He tightened his jaw slightly, trying to remain calm. It was impossible, he told himself silently. Just coincidence. Many performers shared similar styles. Many interpretations could sound familiar. But deep inside, he knew it was not that simple. The young pianist moved into a softer section of the performance. The sound became more delicate, almost fragile. It felt like a memory being carefully unfolded, piece by piece, without rushing. The hall remained completely silent, except for the music that filled every corner of the space. Some audience members had closed their eyes. Others were staring at the stage without blinking. A few even had subtle changes in their expressions, as if something personal had been touched inside them. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, but it was powerful. The royal critic's attention was now fully locked onto the performance. He was no longer casually observing. He was listening with complete focus, even though he did not fully understand why. Then came a moment in the music that changed everything. The melody entered a passage that felt deeply emotional. The phrasing, the timing, the softness between notes. It all carried a specific style that triggered something in his memory. It was not just similar. It was almost identical to something he had once heard long ago, in a different place, during a time he rarely allowed himself to remember. His breath slowed. For a brief moment, his eyes lost their usual sharpness. The music had touched something buried deep inside him. A memory began to surface. Not clearly at first. Just fragments. A quiet room. A piano being played with deep emotion. A presence that felt familiar, warm, and unforgettable. He blinked once, trying to return to the present. But the feeling did not leave. It only grew stronger. On stage, the young pianist continued without pause. Her expression remained calm, but there was something more present in her playing now. A kind of emotional intensity that came naturally, not forced. The music was no longer just a performance. It felt like a story being told through sound. The hall had become completely absorbed. Even people who had initially come with casual interest were now fully engaged. No one was checking their phones. No one was whispering. Every person was focused on the stage. Backstage, a staff member quietly stepped back from the curtain, as if even being too close felt intrusive. The energy in the hall was too strong to ignore. The royal critic, however, was experiencing something different from the rest of the audience. For others, it was a beautiful performance. For him, it was becoming personal. The melody shifted again, and this time it felt unmistakable. His fingers slightly tensed where they rested. He recognized the emotional structure, the way certain notes were held longer than expected, the gentle pauses that carried meaning instead of silence, the way the music seemed to breathe instead of simply progress. It was a style he had not heard in many years, a style connected to someone he had once known closely. His thoughts resisted the memory, but the music pushed it forward anyway. The young pianist played on, unaware of the internal storm she was slowly creating in one of the most powerful critics in the room. To her, the music was honest expression. She was not thinking about influence or recognition. She was simply letting emotion flow through her hands. But to the critic, something deeper was happening. The performance was not just reminding him of the past. It was forcing him to feel it again. A moment in his life he had never fully dealt with. A memory connected to music, emotion, and someone who had once played with a style that felt impossible to forget. He shifted slightly in his seat, his usual composed posture breaking just a little. The audience around him did not notice. They were too focused on the stage. But internally he was no longer the same. The music had reached a point where it no longer felt like an external performance. Felt like something was being returned to him, a forgotten piece of his own history. And as the final part of this emotional passage began to build softly in the hall, the critic realized something he was not ready to accept. This performance was not just impressing him. It was confronting him. The hall felt different now, almost as if the air itself had changed. The music from the young pianist was no longer just something being performed on a stage. It had become something alive inside the room, moving gently through every corner, touching every listener in a quiet but powerful way. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Even small sounds felt too heavy to make. The young pianist continued to play with steady hands. Her face remained calm, but her eyes showed deep focus. She was not thinking about the size of the audience or the importance of the event. In her mind, there was only the piano and the emotion she was trying to express. Each note she played carried a feeling, as if she was speaking through sound instead of words. The melody slowly grew richer. It was not loud or fast, but it carried layers of emotion that built gently over time. The audience could feel it rising, like something soft but powerful unfolding inside the hall. Some people leaned forward without realizing it. Others held their breath for longer than they noticed. The entire room seemed to be moving with the rhythm of her music. In the front row, the royal critic remained very still. His expression was no longer calm in the same way it had been earlier. Something in his face had changed. It was subtle, but those who knew him well would have noticed it immediately. His usual confidence, the sharp certainty he carried while judging performances, was no longer fully visible. Now he was listening differently, not as a critic, but as someone who was being reminded of something. The music had reached a point where it no longer felt unfamiliar. The structure of the melody, the emotional flow, the way certain notes were held and released, it all felt strangely connected to something deep in his memory. He tried to remain logical. He tried to focus on technique as he always did, but his mind kept drifting back to a time he had not thought about in years. A time tied to emotion, a time tied to music that felt personal. He tightened his hands together slightly, resting them in his lap. His posture was still controlled, but there was a quiet tension in it now. He did not want to admit what he was feeling. Not yet, not in front of others. But the music did not stop. Continued to grow in emotional depth. On stage, the young pianist moved into a more intense section of the performance. The melody became fuller, more expressive, yet still gentle. It was like watching waves build slowly in the ocean before reaching the shore. There was no sudden change, only steady emotional movement. The hall remained completely silent. Even the faintest sounds, like the shifting of seats or the soft rustle of clothing, had disappeared. The audience was fully absorbed. They were no longer thinking about expectations or judgment. They were simply feeling. And in that silence, something unexpected began to happen inside the royal critic. His memories started to surface more clearly. At first, it was only fragments, a feeling of familiarity, a certain emotional tone that reminded him of someone from his past. But slowly, those fragments became clearer. He began to recognize the style more deeply. The way the melody carried sadness and beauty at the same time. The way it did not rush, but allowed emotions to breathe. It reminded him of someone he had known long ago. Someone whose music had once carried a very personal style. A style that he had never been able to forget completely. He blinked slowly, as if trying to separate memory from reality. But the more he listened, the harder it became to ignore. The connection was not just emotional anymore. It was structural. The way the notes were arranged, the emotional pauses, even the softness of certain transitions, it all felt like something he had heard before in a very specific moment of his life. The young pianist continued playing. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and focused. But the emotion in her performance had deepened even further. It was no longer just a musical interpretation. It felt like she was telling a story that came from somewhere beyond the stage. The audience felt it too. Some people had tears in their eyes without fully understanding why. Others sat completely still, as if afraid that any movement might break the moment. The hall was no longer just a place for performance. It had become a shared emotional space. The royal critic, however, was experiencing something more complex. The music was not only moving him, it was confronting him. Each phrase felt like it was unlocking something inside him that he had kept closed for a long time. He began to remember a voice, a presence, and a musical style that had once been very close to him. It was connected to a time when music was not about judgment or competition, but about feeling and connection. His breathing became slightly uneven, though he tried to hide it. He had built his reputation on being firm, objective, and emotionally controlled. But now, sitting in the front row of this grand hall, he felt that control slipping, not suddenly, but slowly, like something carefully loosening from within. On stage, the young pianist reached one of the most emotional parts of the piece. The melody softened again. It became almost delicate, like a memory being whispered instead of spoken aloud. The hall seemed to lean into it. Every person was listening in complete silence, as if afraid that even a single sound might disturb something important. The critic's eyes did not leave the stage. Now he was fully focused on the music, not as a judge, but as someone searching for answers. And then it happened. A specific musical phrase began. It was simple but deeply expressive. The way it was played, the emotional shaping of the notes, the gentle rise and fall. It was unmistakable. His breath stopped for a brief moment. His mind finally placed it. It was not just similar. It was the same emotional style he had once heard from someone very important in his past. Someone whose music had carried a unique interpretation of emotion that no one else had been able to replicate. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough for someone paying attention to notice. A slight widening of the eyes. A pause in his usual composed behavior. A quiet realization beginning to form. The young pianist continued playing, unaware of the emotional shift happening in the front row. To her, the music was natural expression. She was not trying to create a reaction. She was simply continuing the flow of what she felt inside. But for the critic, the situation was no longer just about performance. It was becoming deeply personal. The melody reached a soft pause before continuing again, and in that brief silence, his thoughts became clearer than they had been the entire evening. He realized something he had not expected. This style, this emotion, this interpretation, it was not just reminding him of the past. It was connected to it. And as the next notes began to fill the hall again, the critic slowly understood that what he was hearing was not something ordinary. It was something he thought he had lost long ago, returning to him through music in a way he could never have prepared for. The hall had reached a point where silence felt heavier than sound. Every person inside was fully absorbed, not just listening anymore, but experiencing something they could not easily explain. The young pianist continued to play, her fingers moving with quiet confidence, shaping the final part of her performance with deep emotional control. The melody was now softer than before, almost like a gentle closing of a long story. It carried a calm sadness, mixed with warmth, as if it was saying goodbye to something important while still holding onto its memory. The sound spread through the hall slowly, touching every corner without rushing, without pressure. In the front row, the royal critic sat completely still. But inside him, nothing was still. His mind had entered a space he had not visited in years. The music had broken through something he had built carefully over time. He had always believed that judgment required emotional distance, that personal feelings could weaken clarity. But what he was feeling now was not something he could simply ignore or categorize. It was recognition, not of a person standing on stage, but of a memory buried deep within him. The musical style, the emotional flow, the phrasing of each note, it all connected to something he thought he had left behind. A time when music was not about reputation or criticism, but about expression. A time when he had listened to someone play with a depth that stayed in his memory far longer than he ever admitted. He tightened his hands slightly, resting them together as if trying to hold himself steady. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes were no longer sharp in the same way. They carried something quieter now, something uncertain. On stage, the young pianist reached the final section of the performance. The melody became even more delicate. Each note felt carefully placed, like stepping stones across still water. There was no rush, no force, just gentle emotion flowing naturally from her hands. The hall was completely silent now. Not a single whisper, not a single movement that could distract from the sound. People were fully connected to the music. Some felt calm, some felt emotional, some simply could not explain what they were feeling at all. The royal critic, however, was going through something deeper than emotional response. He was remembering. First, it was unclear. Just fragments. A room. A piano. A presence that felt familiar. But slowly, those fragments started forming into something clearer. A musical interpretation he had once heard in his early years. A style that carried emotion in a way that could not be trained easily. It had always felt natural, almost like the music was being felt rather than performed. And then it struck him more clearly. The emotional structure of this performance was not random. It followed a very specific pattern. A pattern connected to someone from his past. His breathing slowed. He did not move, but something inside him had shifted completely. The young pianist continued playing, unaware of the storm forming quietly in one man's mind. She had entered the final emotional passage now. The music felt like it was gently closing a circle. Not ending abruptly, but fading with meaning, like a story being placed carefully back into memory. The hall felt frozen in time. Even the staff backstage had stopped moving entirely. Everyone was listening. The critic's thoughts became sharper now, not in judgment, but in realization. He began connecting details he had ignored earlier. The emotional phrasing, the softness in transitions, the way certain notes were held just slightly longer than expected, creating a feeling of longing. It was not a coincidence. It was intentional, and it was deeply familiar. His eyes slowly softened as memory and reality began to overlap. He remembered a time when music had been shared not for performance, but for expression between people who understood emotion deeply. He remembered a particular style that carried warmth and sadness together, a kind of interpretation that could not be easily copied. And now, hearing it again, he felt something unexpected. Not just recognition, but emotional return. The final section of the performance began. The melody became even quieter. It felt like a whisper now, something fading gently into silence. Each note carried weight, even though it was soft. The audience was completely still. No one wanted to disturb the moment. It felt fragile, like it could disappear if interrupted. The young pianist's hands moved slowly, carefully guiding the final phrases. There was no show of technique anymore, only emotion, pure and steady emotion flowing through sound. And then came the final sequence, a short, beautiful progression of notes that carried the heart of the entire performance. It was simple but deeply meaningful. It felt like understanding something without needing words. The critic felt it clearly. It was the same emotional signature he had once heard in a very personal moment from his past. His chest felt tight, not from pain, but from realization. For the first time in a long time, he was not analyzing. He was remembering. The final note approached. The hall seemed to hold its breath together. The young pianist played the last few notes with gentle control, allowing them to linger in the air before slowly fading into silence. And then it ended. For a moment, there was no sound at all. No applause. No movement. Only silence. A complete, heavy silence that filled the entire hall, as if everyone was still inside the music, unable to return to reality immediately. The young pianist kept her hands on the keys for a brief moment longer, as if allowing the final emotion to settle. Then she slowly lifted them and sat still. The silence continued, felt longer than normal, almost sacred. Then, slowly, the audience began to react. First, it was just a few claps. Then more joined. And within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. Not casual applause, but strong, emotional applause. People stood up without thinking. Some clapped with deep feeling. Others simply stayed standing in respect. But in the front row, the royal critic did not move immediately. He remained seated. His eyes were still fixed on the stage. His expression was different now. Not cold, not sharp, but deeply affected. He was no longer the critic everyone knew in that hall. He was a man who had just been reminded of something he thought was gone forever. The applause around him continued, but inside him there was silence of another kind. A silence filled with memory, realization, and emotion he had long avoided. Slowly he stood up, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet heaviness. The audience did not notice at first. They were still focused on the stage, still applauding the young pianist. But the people nearby saw it. The most respected critic in the hall was standing, looking at the stage with an expression no one had seen before. The young pianist remained seated at the piano for a moment, then slowly stood and turned toward the audience. She bowed gently, her expression calm, still unaware of the deeper emotional shift she had created in one person's life. The applause continued, but the critic did not clap. Instead, he just watched, because for him, this was no longer just a performance. It was something far more personal, something that had returned to him through music, without warning, after being silent for many years.